Now, as it happens, our first set of speakers were not content with simply being engaged. They went ahead and got married. Now, let me begin their introduction, fittingly enough, with a story about New York and food. In 2008, as you may know, New York became the first city in the nation to require fast food restaurants to display calorie counts on their menus. The intent was clear: to combat the country's growing obesity epidemic, especially among children. So too was the expectation that people better informed, armed with this information and knowledge, would make healthier food choices. Soon after, national legislation followed, and many similar requirements went into effect. Yet earlier this year, researchers at NYU made a disheartening discovery. There was no significant change in the number of calories consumed before or after the labeling started. Worse, there was no change in the number of calories for choices that parents made for their children. So, what accounts for this result? And why did the state health department expect to find something different? The answers lie in the fields of consumer and social psychology and decision theory. And Penn is lucky enough to have not one, but two of the country's leading minds in these disciplines. And for the first time at Engaging Minds, you're getting a 2-for-1 deal. They're both with us this morning. Professor Barbara Mellers studies how people formulate preferences and arrive at choices. Her extensive and globally influential work focuses on decisions that deviate from rational principles due to concerns about fairness, past mistakes, or emotions. At Penn, she is I. George Heyman University professor with appointments in the Department of Psychology in our School of Arts and Sciences and in the Department of Marketing in the Wharton School. Professor Philip Tetlock is also world-renowned as a scholar of decision-making. Among other things, he has argued that so-called expert predictions of political and economic trends are rarely more reliable than those of non-experts, angering just a few experts in the process. Currently, he studies organizational decision-making. At Penn, he is Lenore Annenberg University professor with appointments in the Department of Psychology in the School of Arts and Sciences and in the Department of Management in the Wharton School. Please join me in welcoming Barbara Mellers and Philip Tetlock.
Well, thank you very much, Amy and Vince, for having us here. It's a great honor. My wife Barb and I actually belong on the first slide. We should have pasted pictures of us on the first slide. We belong with the dart-throwing chimp, the dart-throwing fox, the dart-throwing hedgehog, and the black swan looming ominously over the proceedings. Those of you who know Nassim Taleb's work know the black swan joke. Now, we belong on the first slide because we're also participants in the great IARPA forecasting tournament. IARPA, Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Agency, is part of the Washington, D.C. alphabet soup of agencies. It's embedded within something called ODNI, which is the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. ODNI was created by Congress in the aftermath of 9/11. It was created in response to the Presidential Commission critique that the intelligence agencies didn't know how to connect the dots. So the idea would be to create an umbrella organization that would force them to connect the dots. So if it weren't for 9/11, IARPA wouldn't exist, and I wouldn't be here talking about this particular forecasting tournament. In other words, Osama bin Laden is in some sense responsible for my being here talking to you. Which I can assure you is something that I could never have predicted in a million years 11 years ago. There's something about life that's, life is a rather quirky, path-dependent meander, the statisticians sometimes like to say. And it's humbling. Trying to predict things can be humbling and deeply instructive. Now, IARPA has commissioned a forecasting tournament that challenges 5 designated teams, all based in universities, to do their best at assigning realistic odds to political, economic, and military outcomes that key decision makers in government care about. So it might be whether Italy is going to be forced to restructure its debt within a designated time frame, who the next president of Russia is going to be, although that's been de facto resolved, whether Pakistan is going to force the United States to shut down all of its military facilities in the country, whether the UN would pass the Palestine statehood resolution within a designated time frame. Just an enormous range of questions that policymakers in the State Department, within the Defense Department, within the White House care about. Now, it turns out that to do well in a tournament of this sort, you have to break some habits. You have to get out of the habit of relying on vague verbiage to express your uncertainty. Words are very elastic. Many political pundits often frame their analyses in terms of things that might happen or could happen if this or that were to happen. And it's understandable why they do so, because there is such an enormous cloud of uncertainty. But words are elastic. The word could mean a lot of different things. I could say that I think an asteroid is going to hit this building in the next half hour. And that might mean their could would take on the probabilistic value of 1 in, say, 10 to the 25th power. Or I could say something like, I think Mitt Romney could become the next president of the United States, and that might mean a probability of 0.3 or 0.4, and many millions of times bigger than the first probability. So you need to get out of the habit of relying on vague verbiage and translating vague, subjective senses of uncertainty into a subjective probability metric, because that's the only way we know how to keep score reliably on accuracy. If anyone else knows a better way, please tell us in the Q&A. So one of our major themes, and Barb's going to pick up on this in her part of our presentation, is the great value of learning to cultivating the art of translating uncertainty into a metric that can be scored for accuracy, and then getting into the habit of actually keeping score over protracted periods of time. If good judgment is important to you within a domain, this is an art that you should seriously consider cultivating. It's remarkable that the intelligence community had done, prior to IARPA, as little in this area as it has. You would think that the intelligence community would be able to answer the question of how accurate their forecasters typically are. And it's an amazing thing that's happened with this tournament, because you have a major government agency doing something the government agencies are not famous for doing, sponsoring a project that could be embarrassing to them. Because it could well turn out that the highly trained analysts can't do much better than some rather minimalist baselines. So their willingness to subject themselves to critical scrutiny is something I strongly commend. It's an unusual thing, and I think it's politically brave. Now, each of the 4 creatures up here represents an understandable human reaction to living in a universe that is in part deterministic and in part stochastic. What do I mean by that? Well, part of our universe, some things in our world really are very, very predictable. They follow certain well-defined scientific laws and principles. Foucault's pendulum would be a classic example of that, where the ball swings as a function of Newtonian laws of motion and the rotation of the Earth. At the other end of the continuum, we have things that we know are perfectly unpredictable. So a roulette wheel, assuming it hasn't been rigged, you're not going to be able to do any better than the proverbial dart-throwing chimpanzee in predicting the outcomes of the roulette wheel. And other things are in this intermediate zone, like hurricanes. We don't have the faintest idea how to predict exactly when and where hurricanes will start. In fact, some meteorologists have run computer simulations that suggest that highly trivial antecedent causes, like the flapping of a butterfly's wings in Beijing, could trigger a hurricane in the Caribbean. Complexity and chaos theorists. So we can't predict that. We're very, very confident of that, actually. But once a hurricane is started, we can create models that do a very good job 80, 90% accuracy of predicting how intense it's going to become and of where it's going to go. So predictability is a matter of degree. It depends on the context. And mapping out when it's possible and when it's impossible is valuable to government decision makers. And I think it's valuable to people in the private sector. And indeed, I think in some cases to people in their everyday lives. So 4 creatures here. The chimp symbolizes surrender to the stochastic. It's basically a way of saying, I admit it. You know, the mutual fund manager throws up his hands in despair and says, okay, I can't beat the market averages. I just can't do it. I give up. The other two of the other creatures, the hedgehog and the fox, come out of a book I did called Expert Political Judgment, How Good Is It, How Can We Know? It came out about 7 years ago. And I borrowed the hedgehog-fox metaphor from a famous political philosopher in England, Isaiah Berlin, who borrowed it in turn from a famous poet, a not so famous poet in ancient Greece, Archilochus. And he left, one of the surviving fragments of his poetry was a line that took the following form in translation. It was that the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. So the hedgehog represents a can-do attitude toward mastering the causal structure of the environment and extracting as powerful predictive signals as you can from that environment. Hedgehogs come in many forms. There are boomster hedgehogs who believe that the long-term trends are for growth, and we're very inventive at coming up with ingenious technological substitutes for anything we're running out of. And they believe that we're on a trajectory toward longer life. People in the 23rd century are going to be healthier and smarter and wealthier than anything we can imagine right now. And there are doomster hedgehogs who believe that we're running out of things and that we're bequeathing a world to our children, that our grandchildren, that is not at all attractive. Sometimes rooted in the thought of a scholar Malthus. Now, there are many different types of hedgehog. You can be a left-wing hedgehog, you can be a right-wing hedgehog. You can be a boomster hedgehog, you can be a doomster hedgehog. But the thing about hedgehogs is they know their mind. They think they have a key to understanding this peculiar universe we happen to inhabit. Now the fox, on the other hand, knows many things. And this fox symbolizes the cunning exploitation of hedgehog blind spots. So hedgehogs often become overconfident about what's going to happen in a particular domain, and the foxes often find an opportunity there to be more accurate. Those of you who work in financial markets may recognize these particular personality types. And then finally, the black swan symbolizes this notion of radical unpredictability, which Nassim Taleb popularized in his book from a few years ago. It's the idea that we don't know what we don't know. We don't even know how to ask the right questions. We're not aiming at the right dartboard. So it's a truly foundational challenge to the exercise, but it's one that's useful to keep in mind. Now, this side of God, all forecasters cannot confront the following primal trade-off. You cannot be perfectly accurate. So you're going to have to confront a trade-off between making two kinds of prediction errors. You can over-predict or you can under-predict things that are going to happen. What we saw with the intelligence community with weapons of mass destruction in Iraq is that they seemed to over-connect the dots. And they made a false positive prediction of nuclear and chemical weapons programs in Iraq. What seemed to happen with 9/11 was under-connecting the dots, a false negative judgment. Some people believe that the reason the intelligence community made the false positive judgment in the case of Iraq was because it made the false negative judgment in the case of 9/11. And that the accountability community is caught on a kind of game of accountability ping pong, in which first they get slammed for making an error in one direction, then they get slammed for making an error in another direction. The pessimists say that's the fate of the intelligence community. They'll be forever batted back and forth, and there's no hope to become incrementally more accurate. This IARPA forecasting tournament is based on the premise of a long-term commitment to government learning and to being able to reduce both false positives and false negatives if you approach it in a systematic and scientific way rather than a highly reactive way being bashed by the latest presidential commission for the latest error. And then finally, there's the interesting case of finding Osama bin Laden when the intelligence community got it right. Of course, it could have gotten it wrong. When President Obama made that decision, the reports suggest that the intelligence community wasn't able to put a probability much more than 50-50 on whether Osama bin Laden actually was in that house in Abbottabad, Pakistan. Now, I can assure you that if he hadn't been in that house, that would be a serious error. And people would be looking at that decision very differently. So the IARPA, Great IARPA Forecasting Tournament is the intelligence community's effort to escape endless cycles of accountability ping pong, to escape decades of hindsight-guided second guessing. Because once we know that an outcome has occurred, that inevitably taints our estimates of how likely or inevitable that outcome was. It's once you know an outcome has occurred, it's very hard to recapture your past states of ignorance and how unsure you once were of what was going to happen. And finally, it's an effort by IARPA to escape the practice of buying lots of products from consultants that promise to improve prediction but are never systematically tested. So the intelligence community spends many tens and hundreds of millions of dollars on lots of techniques, and believe it or not, people aren't keeping systematic score. So this is, again, something very, very commendable that IARPA is doing. It's potentially embarrassing because it may suggest that many of the things they've been buying in the past don't work very well. This is not something that politically shrewd bureaucrats are supposed to do in Washington, D.C. I think Zeke can testify to that in his presentation. The solution from IARPA's point of view is to sponsor a level playing field forecasting tournament that pits dozens of approaches against each other over hundreds of questions over several years. And that's the project that Barb and I are enmeshed in right now. And Barb's going to be talking about some of the measurement challenges, and she's going to share with you an exercise that illustrates the challenges of translating your vague, subjective senses of uncertainty into a metric. And it'll give you a little taste of what the forecasters in our tournament are actually doing. So, Barb.
Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. I want to announce that we'll take questions for both of us as soon as I'm done. I've spent the last 30 years of my life studying human judgment and decision making, and I am so excited to have this opportunity to study this particular aspect of human judgment, and that is forecasting. We've studied errors and biases in decision makings for decades now, and here is a chance to investigate how people make good predictions and how to make them even better. As Phil said, we're one of 5 teams funded by IARPA to study human forecasting over a 4-year period. Only 3 months have passed in that 4-year period. So I'm not going to be able to tell you much about results. I would be delighted to come back and tell you in a year or two exactly what we have learned. We've learned a bit. We've had a 3-month dry period so far, but the tournament officially started on December 1st. Each of the 5 teams recruits their own forecasters, and these forecasters are people who have at least a BA or BS or higher. Our team has recruited about 3,000 forecasters, and we're always looking for more. So I'm going to come back to this. I'm going to invite you all to be forecasters in our tournament and tell you a little bit about some of the side benefits from doing so. Okay, we are on a team of about 25, 30 people, faculty and graduate students. Many of the faculty are wonderful people at Penn in computer science, in business, in psychology, and other domains. We have statistics. We have people all over the world who are working with us at the Hebrew University and Rice University and UC Berkeley. That's probably enough detail. Let me tell you a little bit more about what we're doing. Now, there's only one way, as Phil said, to find out which forecasting method is best. which forecasters are best, and ultimately which team wins the IARPA contest. I'm going to show you how we're being kept score. We'll be using a method known as Breyer scoring. It's very common in the world of forecasting, and I'll give you an example with a weather forecaster. Okay, in this example, we have day 1. Our forecaster makes a prediction of 90% chance of rain. The 1 under the rain column means it actually rained. And over here on the right, you can see how the Breyer score is computed. Squared differences between the actual outcome and the forecast, plus the counterfactual outcome and the forecast that would be associated with that. The best score you can get is 0. The worst score is 2. So let's see here. On the first day, our forecaster is doing pretty well. 90% chance of rain, and it rains. Day 2 comes along, 20% chance of rain, it doesn't rain. Things are looking great, Breyer scores are very small. Day 3 comes along, 70% chance of rain, not so good, it doesn't rain. Day 4, 20% chance of rain, and it does. So this person is able to call the shots correctly some of the time and not on other days. So this is a skill, this aspect of forecasting is known as discrimination. He's able to discriminate the signal from the noise some of the time, but certainly not all of the time. That's one feature or aspect of forecasting that we're going to be measuring. Another one is called calibration. And that's the ability to make good, long-run, average forecasts. And in this example I've given you, the person who's not so good at discriminating is very good at, at calibration. On average, he predicts rain 50% of the time, and on average, it rains 50% of the time. May not be right on any given day, but in the long run, it's got it right. Now, this particular skill, calibration, is extremely hard. And violations of this have been demonstrated in all kinds of professions, in the law, in economics, in financial investments. It's the rare few who get this right. And some of the winners in this are weather forecasters, bridge players who are predicting the number of contracts they'll make, and odds makers at the racetrack. And what they all have in common is the opportunity to get clear, clean, immediate feedback about their judgment. Right? Most of the time in the world, we lack that opportunity. So, just to let you know how difficult good calibration is, I'm going to do a demonstration with you. And I think on your tables, you all have a little booklet with a pen and a piece of paper. We'll do an exercise on calibration. Let's see. And I'm going to do it like this. I'll give you 10 questions. There'll be 10 events. And I want you to say, I don't want you to give me the correct answer, but I do want you to give me a 90% confidence interval. So that means an interval such that you're 90% sure the actual answer falls within it. Got it? So you'll specify the upper and the lower bound for your interval, all right? There'll be 10 questions. If you are indeed 90% confident in your answers, in 9 of the 10 cases, the correct answer should fall inside the interval that you specify, okay? All right, let's do it. First question is time elapsed since the Big Bang. So give me an upper bound and a lower bound that reflects your 90% confidence interval. Time elapsed since the Big Bang. Okay, next question is year that John Steinbeck won the Nobel Prize in Literature. Third question, distance in miles or kilometers from the Earth to the Moon. Next question is air distance in miles or kilometers from Madrid to Baghdad. Five is year the construction of the Roman Colosseum was completed, was finished. Six, year that Magellan's crew completed the first naval circumnavigation of the globe. Seven, height in feet or meters of the Aswan High Dam. Yeah, right, huh? Year that 8 is year that Mohandas K. Gandhi was born. Nine is the surface area in square miles or square kilometers of the Mediterranean Sea. Of course, if you have no idea, you should set your confidence intervals extremely large, right? And number 10 is the gestation period of the great blue whale in days. Okay, now I'll tell you the right answers, and I want you to keep track of the number of times that that right answer falls inside your confidence interval. Okay? The first question. Time elapsed since the Big Bang is 13.8 billion years. Year that John Steinbeck won the Nobel Prize for Literature was 1962. The distance in miles from the Earth to the Moon is 239,000 or 239,000 miles or 380,000 kilometers. The air distance from Madrid to Baghdad is 2,700 miles or 4,300 kilometers. The year the Roman Colosseum was finished was 80 AD. The year that Magellan's crew completed the first naval circumnavigation of the globe was 1522. And the height of the Aswan High Dam is 375 feet or 114 meters. Gandhi was born in 1869. The surface area of the Mediterranean Sea is 970,000 square miles. or 2,500,000 square kilometers. And that poor great white whale, 335 days. Okay, now check to see how many times the correct answer fell inside your interval, Amy. 10 for 10. Okay, well, let's take a poll. Let's take a poll. And those of you for whom 10 times the correct answer fell inside your interval, raise your hands. That's why she's the president of Penn. Okay, now, the next question's important. If you get 9 of the correct answers inside of your intervals, then you are perfectly calibrated. You know what you know, and you know what you don't know. So, show of hands, how many got 9 inside? Correct answers inside? A couple, all right. How about 8? Yeah, good. 7. All right. 6. 5. 4. 3. 2. 1. And I'm not even going to ask about the last one. Okay, well, this is difficult. Yeah, it's hard because we often think we know quite a bit more than we do know. And that in this example is illustrated by having confidence intervals that are far too narrow. Typically, people do set their confidence intervals very narrow relative to their general knowledge on the topic. So, one of the many things we're looking for in terms of forecasting talent is people who don't fall prey to judgmental biases such as overconfidence, confirmation bias, which is to look for the information you want to hear, and discount or disregard evidence that goes against your preconceptions. One of the interesting things we're doing in this tournament is to give our forecasters a large battery of psychological tests and cognitive ability tests, cognitive style, motivation, political ideology, political knowledge, and so forth. And we're looking for variables that correlate with forecasting accuracy. In other words, later, when everything's said and done and the dust settles, what is it that predicts forecasters who are more accurate than those who aren't? Another aspect of the tournament that we're focused hard on is how to develop better ways of eliciting forecasts. How should you ask the question? And then once you have a set of forecasts, aggregating them into a single prediction. Now, we're exploiting an idea known as the power of aggregation. And this idea is nicely illustrated in a story about Francis Galton that perhaps some of you have already heard. It's just so nice, I love to tell it. Galton was a real character, and he was interested in many things. One of the things he was interested in was measurement. He measured everything under the sun. And one day, he went to a country fair. This was in 1906. And there was a contest going on. Villagers were asked to guess the weight of an ox that was on display once it was slaughtered and so forth. The person who gave the best estimate of the ox's weight would win the ox. Now, lots of people submitted their guesses, so-called experts, in this case farmers and butchers, and non-experts, shop owners and doctors and so forth. And I don't recall what the best guess was, but after the contest, Galton asked for all of the estimates. And he took them home computed the average. Now, this was before we knew that an average was a very good way of reducing error in an estimate, and found that the average guess was 1,197 pounds. And the weight of the ox was 1,198 pounds. That's to say, the aggregate, the combination of information from a lot of people who knew a lot of different things turned out to be better than the best estimate submitted to the contest. So we're exploiting this idea of aggregation, and of course opinion polls and prediction markets are two different ways in which you can use aggregation. I didn't change the Mitt Romney. His odds have gone down this week. You can now buy Mitt Romney shares for 47.9% on the dollar. There's a huge academic literature on whether opinion polls work better than prediction markets, and the verdict is still out. We're addressing this controversy because we've set up several different conditions. We're pitting prediction markets against different forms of opinion polls, some in which people don't talk to each other at all, as in the Galton demonstration, some in which people are able to learn the distribution of beliefs of others, okay? And other conditions in which people work in small teams and explain the rationales for their forecasts, and people can comment on those rationales, and you can defend your rationale. It's a bit like a Delphi method, but a bit different. So we have an opportunity here to look, holding everything else constant, look at different ways of eliciting and aggregating forecasts to come up with the most accurate forecast. Now, there are many other issues involved, weighting of forecasts. We're working on a variety of different algorithms we'd be happy to tell you about. I'm sure I've run out of time here, so let me just wrap up by saying we would be delighted to have any and all of you join us in this forecasting tournament. We'll be starting up again, taking new forecasters sometime next June. If you're interested, please use that pencil and paper to write down the website. It's goodjudgment.info, and we hope to see you there. Thank you. Oh. We have a few minutes for questions? Okay. Any questions? Yeah.
There are 5 teams working on this.
Yeah.
And so one is supposed to do better than the other.
Yeah.
4. How will you know that that's not the result of chance?
By having many questions over an extended period of time. So each year there are roughly 100 forecasts that our forecasters make, and we have a lot of opportunities to reduce the possibility that a good forecast is due to chance rather than skill. Yeah.
I was in the infantry.
There's a microphone.
We didn't know that I was in the infantry, and when we didn't know the distance to a target, 10 people would guess, and then we'd set sights at the average of the 10 people. And we were pretty accurate.
That's right.
I didn't know it had a formal name. Golden distribution. We've been using it forever and ever.
Thank you. Yeah.
Financial managers are notoriously bad at predicting financial markets. But why do you think there's such a strong bias? I understand from the forecaster side, because that's how they're paid. They're incentivized.
Right.
But for those who lose money consistently or don't beat the average, why is there such a strong bias towards believing that they're able to do what they can? And secondly, how are the Warren Buffetts of the world able to rise above that trend? I mean, there's a handful of forecasters who do consistently beat the financial markets. How are they able to do it? Have you looked at that area?
Starting with the Warren Buffett question first, there is a very active debate among scholars in finance about the degree to which the strength of the evidence for good judgment in finance. There is a radical school of thought, although it has a lot of adherents among professors, that maintains that if you toss enough coins, say you toss hundreds of coins hundreds of times, you're going to wind up with some coins that wind up with streaks. Heads, 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 15, 20, 30 times. So this would be analogous to particular investment strategists outperforming the market by 6, 7 standard deviations. So if you're in that kind of a universe where you have enough people making enough judgments, by chance,